The clay tablet in Vault 29B of the University of Pennsylvania Museum weighs 4 pounds and 3 ounces. Its surface sits at the same temperature as the controlled air around it, a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, when cataloger Margaret Chen first held it in 1952, she wrote that the tablet felt warm against her palms, as if the words pressed into it 4,000 years earlier had not entirely surrendered their heat. The catalog described that sensation as subjective, a private impression, a psychological response. But Chen never withdrew the claim. She had handled thousands of tablets. She knew the dead coolness of baked clay. This one, she insisted, felt different, not because of its shape, not because of its weight, not because of any damage or rarity visible to the eye. It felt different because of what it said, because this was not a king celebrating victory, not a merchant recording grain, not a hymn asking for fertility or rain. It was, she believed, the record of a decision made by gods against the beings they had created. That is where this investigation begins, not with certainty, not with proof, but with a question that returns again and again the longer one sits with these tablets. What if these texts are not trying to invent mythology, but preserve memory? What if the conflicts, the warnings, the conspiracies of silence, the procedural debates, the broken oaths, all of it were written down by scribes who believed they were documenting truth in the only language available to them, the language of administration, of kingship, of jurisdiction, of law. The tablet speaks of betrayal, but not betrayal in the language we would expect. Not betrayal as emotion, not betrayal as wounded feeling. The nearest Sumerian terms belong instead to broken oaths, violated agreements, overstepped authority, breached procedure. The grammar is closer to governance than to poetry, and across tablets recovered from Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, a pattern emerges with unnerving consistency. The Anunnaki are not presented as a harmonious divine family. They are not described as a single unified will. They deceive one another. They compete. They overreach. They countermand. And most unsettling of all, they disagree about whether humanity deserves to continue existing at all. That is why the old question does not go away. Are we reading myths created to explain the world? Or are we reading records from a civilization that believed the world was governed by authorities, whose conflicts were real, whose councils were formal, whose votes mattered, and whose betrayals carried consequences measured in the survival of cities and peoples? The wedges pressed into that clay remained sharp after 40 centuries. A reed stylus made each sign in soft clay. The sun hardened it. Time preserved it. Every line follows the next with grammatical precision. This does not read like improvised storytelling. It reads like record keeping, like an account of a choice made of silence, demanded of one dissenting voice that refused consensus and allowed a remnant to survive. And still the question remains. It remains because it cannot be settled by atmosphere. It remains because wonder is not evidence. It remains because the warmth Margaret Chen felt in her hands proves nothing. But the words themselves do not depend on her impression. The words remain, and they force us back to the same place again and again. What if the scribes believed they were documenting events? What if betrayal in the world these texts describe was not a moral weakness, but a technical violation of order oath and cosmic law? To understand that possibility, we have to reconstruct the system that could be betrayed. The Sumerian texts do not present the Anunnaki as distant abstractions. They present them as a structured authority, name beings, genealogies, cities under patronage, temples serving as residences, councils in which decisions were made through procedure. At the summit stood An or Anu, in later Akkadian tradition, ruling from heaven and intervening rarely. Beneath him sat the Great Council, the powerful figures who decreed fate and supervised the order of the world. Membership shifts slightly across city traditions, but the structure remains. Enlil, Enki, Nenhursag, Nana, Utu, Inanna, sometimes Ninurta, depending on the source. Enlil holds the title associated with rule over lands. His center is Nippur, the administrative heart in so many of these texts. He is linked to storms, the air agriculture, terrestrial order, and the tablet of destinies itself, the object or instrument through which authority is declared. Enki, by contrast, governs the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm beneath the earth. His city is Eridu, oldest in the king lists, oldest in memory, oldest perhaps because the texts need it to be old. His domain is wisdom, craft, water magic design. He is the giver of techniques of skills of civilization's practical arts. He teaches irrigation, writing, number, medicine, law, metalwork. But he is also consistently described as clever to the edge of subversion. When he disagrees, he does not always resist openly. He evades, he maneuvers, he finds the technical opening. This is not a vague division. It is jurisdictional. Enlil above, Enki below, surface and depth, atmospheric order and subterranean knowledge, civilization as command and civilization as craft. The texts return to this division so often that it begins to feel foundational, perhaps even unstable from the beginning, because clear boundaries do not always create peace. Sometimes they create pressure. Sometimes the sharper the boundary, the sharper the conflict when one side crosses it. The Weld Blundell prism preserves the king list in a form that still startles modern readers. 8 kings, 5 cities, reigns stretching across spans we would call impossible. Then a simple break. The flood swept over. After that, dynasties resume with reigns that seem comparatively familiar. The text offers no dramatic interpretation, no theological sermon. It records discontinuity and continues. Governance before, flood, governance after. That restraint matters. It matters because it tells us something about tone. The tablets do not always announce myth when myth is what they are presumed to contain. They often proceed with the dry confidence of administration. A catastrophe happened. A line was broken. Rule resumed elsewhere. The question is not whether the text feels strange. Of course it does. The question is why it feels so procedural while describing things so immense. And that is where the sense of betrayal begins to deepen. Because when later tablets describe why the flood came, they do not speak of an unexplained act of divine wrath. They describe counsel, debate, oath, silence, intervention, procedure first, then catastrophe. Before the fracture, there was a system. Before the betrayal, there was a council. Before the warning whispered to the reed wall, there was governance. And in the next part, that is where we remain a little longer, because the language of these tablets matters as much as the events they claim to describe. Not just what happened, but how it is recorded. Not just the story, but the grammar of the story. The legal rhythm, the administrative calm, the sense line after line, that someone believed procedure itself was sacred enough to preserve. One of the most striking things about these tablets is not what they say, but how they say it. Again and again, where later readers expect soaring mythology, they find something drier, more measured, more procedural. The syntax is repetitive in the way administrative language is repetitive. The formulas recur like clauses in contracts. Speakers are identified. Accusations are stated. Instructions are delivered in order. Sentences are imposed. Conditions are satisfied. It does not feel improvised. It feels recorded. Consider the opening logic of the Atrahasis tradition. The gods bore labor. The labor was heavy. The burden was too much. The drudgery became intolerable. This is not the elevated style of epic ornament. It sounds closer to grievance language, closer to a labor dispute than a hymn. The lesser gods, exhausted by canal work and earthworks, organize themselves, appoint a spokesman, and confront Enlil's order. What follows is not chaotic divine melodrama. It is a sequence of deliberation. The council is summoned. The members arrive. Rank is observed. The question is asked in formal terms. What is the charge? What has compelled this rebellion? The answer is equally procedural. Forced labor, unendurable burden, excessive misery. The solution then proposed is not mystical in tone, even if its content is immense. Let a new being be made. Let that being assume the labor. Let clay be mixed with the blood of a slain god. Let humanity bear the toil the lesser gods refuse to continue. Even here, the language remains technical. There are instructions for creation. There are stages. There are divine words to be spoken. There is a number of birth goddesses required. 7 and 7. Not because the scene is less strange, but because it is narrated as process rather than vision. The same habit continues elsewhere. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu must die, the gods do not merely punish him in a burst of mythic outrage. They convene. They take their seats. The great gods hold council. An accusation is made. A sentence is discussed. Anu speaks and Lil answers. Ea objects. Jurisdiction is implied. Responsibility is weighed. Then a decision follows. Between the two heroes, one must die. Enkidu is selected. The language is not romanticized. It is judicial. Even Enkidu's final laments carry that quality. He does not only grieve death, he grieves the manner of death, not in battle, not in visible glory, but under sentence. There is a distinction there, and the text lets the distinction stand. It records the psychology of someone who understands judgment has been rendered against him. The descent of Inanna goes further still. Before she enters the underworld, she prepares contingencies. If I do not return, do this. Go here, then go there. Appeal first to Enlil, then to Nanna, then to Enki. The order matters. The sequence matters. The script for what should happen in her absence is laid out in advance, as if she is moving through a diplomatic hazard rather than entering a symbolic dreamscape. At each gate she is stopped. At each gate she must identify herself. At each gate she states her purpose. At each gate a rule is invoked. One article of regalia removed, then another, then another. This is not merely vivid ritual, it is jurisdiction enforced step by step. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she stands stripped not only of ornament, but of recognized authority. Then comes one of the most chilling moments in the corpus. The judges surround her. Judgment is passed. She becomes a corpse on a hook. No motive is expanded. No moral explanation is inserted. Procedure is enough. Entry occurred. Law was applied. Sentence followed. Even the recovery of Inanna does not break this procedural tone. Ninshuber follows instructions exactly. Enlil refuses. Nana refuses. Enki responds differently, but even his rescue is not random mercy. He fashions beings for a purpose. He gives them exact words to use. They descend. They speak sympathy at the correct moment. They receive permission. They take the corpse. They apply the food and water of life. She rises. Then the underworld states its own rule: no one leaves without a substitute. Again, the text does not dissolve into symbolism just because the stakes are metaphysical. It continues in legal rhythm. A condition exists. It must be met. A substitute is eventually named. Dumuzi is taken. His sister negotiates a division of obligation. Half and half. The underworld accepts. A permanent arrangement is established. The law is satisfied but not softened. This same procedural language appears in the Curse of Agade. Naram-Sin does not merely anger the gods in some vague theological way. He enters the sacred center he should not violate. He loots it. The text inventories the damage. Silver, gold, copper, lapis lazuli, boats loaded, wealth removed. This is less a mythic tableau than a report of sacrilege in administrative form. The response is equally structured. Enlil withdraws protection. Other gods are invited to allocate curses according to their domains. Agriculture is struck by one, military strength by another, water by another still. Domain by domain, curse by curse order is reversed, and so the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Divine action is described like governance. Conflict is described like litigation, treaty breach, or jurisdictional crisis. Consequences arrive not as emotional storms, but as formal withdrawals, rulings, condemnations, and imposed conditions. Of course, one can still say all of this is metaphor, that ancient people projected their own civic and legal systems onto divine figures because those were the forms of power they knew best. That is possible. It remains possible. But the consistency is what unsettles. Across centuries, across cities, across competing traditions, the language remains stubbornly procedural. If that language is symbolic, it is symbol sustained with bureaucratic precision for more than 1,000 years. If it is not symbolic, then we are looking at something stranger. We are looking at scribes who believed councils existed, who believed oaths mattered, who believed authority could be broken down into ranked jurisdiction and recorded consequence, and who saw no contradiction in describing gods that way, because that was to them how governance worked. This is where the fracture between Enki and Enlil becomes so important, because once the language of law is taken seriously, their conflict no longer reads as a simple rivalry of personalities. It reads like a constitutional problem, a struggle between creator and territorial ruler, between the one who designed humanity and the one who governs the space humanity inhabits. The composition often called Enki and the world order hints at this imbalance. Enki travels, organizes, assigns, functions, arranges the workings of river craft and institution. Yet the text repeatedly notes, in one form or another, Enlil's awareness, Enlil's approval, Enlil's lack of objection. Oversight shadows Enki's actions. The reverse is not true in the same way. When Enlil acts, the world obeys. He does not seem to require Enki's tacit permission. That asymmetry matters. It suggests a system already under strain before the flood was ever proposed. Enki can create and arrange, but Enlil can authorize and command at the highest terrestrial level. It is precisely the kind of divided sovereignty that appears stable until a crisis reveals it is not stable at all. And when that crisis comes, it comes through humanity, through noise, through numbers, through the question of whether a created species becomes the permanent concern of its maker or the permanent concern of the ruler whose land it fills. That question is not resolved by sentiment. It is fought through oath evasion and technicality. So we return to the central issue, and we return to it slowly, because the tablets themselves return slowly. What is betrayal in a world governed by procedure? Is it disobedience? Is it oath-breaking? Is it overreach? Is it the decision to follow justice against consensus? Or is it the decision to follow consensus against life? To ask that we have to enter the first great fracture, directly the long rivalry between Enki and Enlil, where every later break seems already latent, waiting for the moment when divided authority can no longer pretend to be unity. If one conflict lies beneath almost every other fracture in these tablets, it is the long tension between Enki and Enlil. Not because every story names it openly, but because the structure of their opposition seems to underlie so many of the decisions that follow. Enlil governs surface order. Enki governs the deep sources beneath it. Enlil is associated with command kingship and the regulated architecture of civilization. Enki is associated with design wisdom craft and the knowledge that makes civilization function from within. One rules the visible world of hierarchy. The other rules the hidden world of enabling intelligence. The division seems clean at first, but the more the texts speak, the less clean it becomes. Humans were created through Enki's design under conditions established to solve a crisis among the gods. Yet humans live in Enlil's domain on the Earth's surface, cultivating the land, multiplying in cities, generating the noise and pressure that in the flood tradition become the pretext for destruction. So, whose beings are they? The creators or the rulers once they inhabit his territory? The texts never answer directly. They dramatize the consequences of not answering. The flood narrative gives the clearest expression of this constitutional tension. Enlil determines that humanity has become intolerable. Their noise disturbs him. Their multiplication overwhelms the ordered surface world he governs. First, he seeks reduction through plague, then through drought and famine. Each time Enki intervenes, not by open revolt at first, but by tactical instruction. Tell the humans to focus offerings on the one god controlling the crisis. Apply pressure where it matters. Break the alignment supporting Enlil's decision. End the suffering without confronting the policy head-on. Already the pattern is visible. Enki does not merely disagree. He subverts. He does not reject procedure outright. He works around it. That matters because when the third and final decision is made, the council formalizes itself more sharply. The gods swear silence. No warning is to be given. The flood is to come. Humanity is to end. Here the issue is no longer policy only. It becomes oath, collective decision, binding speech. And still Enki finds the opening. He does not, strictly speaking, warn Atrahasis face to face. He speaks to the reed wall. Reed wall, reed wall, listen to my words. The formula is famous because it is so precise. It carries the chill of technical evasion. A warning is delivered without being delivered. A command is issued without directly naming the listener. The boat is described in exact dimensions. The cargo is specified. Survival is engineered through loophole, not through declared rebellion. Enlil's anger afterward is therefore not merely anger at failure. It is anger at a very particular kind of failure, not open defiance, not honest dissent, but procedural circumvention. The oath in spirit has been broken. In letter, Enki claims perhaps that he remained within its boundaries. The tablets preserve that tension. Intent versus language. Justice versus technicality. Consensus versus conscience. From Enlil's position, this is betrayal of the highest order. A sworn decision was subverted. Council authority was weakened. One member acted according to private judgment instead of collective decree. If that becomes acceptable, then the council becomes unstable in every future crisis. From Enki's position, however, another betrayal came first. Humanity had been created to solve divine labor. They had served their purpose. Cities had risen. Offerings had been made. Culture had flourished. To erase them because their presence had become inconvenient was not governance, but abandonment. Not order, but disposable cruelty. If that is what the council's procedure allows, then perhaps the procedure itself is defective. This is why the tablets feel so modern in a deeply uncomfortable way. They do not present a simple villain and rescuer. They present a system whose rules are clear enough to operate, but not wise enough to prevent catastrophe. A council can deliberate and still choose annihilation. An oath can bind and still produce injustice. A dissenting act can save life and still destabilize lawful order. And after the flood, no full reconciliation follows. There is compromise. Humanity survives, but diminished. Lifespans shorten. Fertility is restricted. Infant mortality increases. Certain women do not bear children. Limits are imposed to ensure the species never again reaches pre-flood scale. This is not peace. It is settlement. Not resolution, but managed aftermath. The core issue remains unresolved. Does creator authority end when creation enters another jurisdiction, or does it persist? The texts do not heal that break. They build everything after it in the shadow of that break. That shadow falls heavily over the Adapa narrative as well. Adapa is described as the wise one of Eridu, linked intimately to Enki, sometimes as son, sometimes as specially favored human priest. Enki grants him extraordinary wisdom, understanding of heaven and earth, knowledge of divine matters. But one thing he does not grant is immortality. The text is explicit in its omission. Wisdom, yes. Eternal life, no. Then comes the incident with the south wind. Adapa, fishing in the Gulf, is overturned. In anger, he curses the wind and breaks its wings. For 7 days, the south wind does not blow. The disruption reaches heaven. Anu summons Adapa to answer for what he has done. And now, before Adapa ascends, Enki gives him very specific instructions. When you stand before Anu, they will offer you the bread of death. Do not eat it. They will offer you the water of death. Do not drink it. They will offer a garment. Accept it. Oil. Accept it. The advice seems protective. A superior power may be offering lethal hospitality disguised as favor. Refuse the dangerous substances, accept the neutral honors. On the surface, this is the counsel of a patron guarding his human servant. But when Adapa arrives, Anu is not planning punishment through poisoned food. He is moved instead toward favor. Bread of life is brought. Water of life is brought. Adapa refuses both precisely because he obeys the Creator who taught him wisdom. The moment is devastating because it is so simple. The chance appears, the refusal happens, the opportunity is gone. And Anu's anger turns not toward Adapa, but toward Enki. What has Enki done? That question hangs over the whole tradition. Did Enki misunderstand? Did he protect Adapa from a danger that was no longer intended? Or did he deceive deliberately, ensuring that humanity, even at its wisest, would remain mortal? The text does not answer. It only intensifies the ambiguity. If Enki knew the food was life and named it death anyway, then his role as humanity's protector becomes more complex, perhaps darker. Perhaps he wished humans to be wise, but not equal. Capable, but limited. Useful, but never immortal. Empowered enough to sustain civilization, but never so empowered that the gap between divine and human authority vanished. Yet another possibility emerges if we stay inside the jurisdictional logic of the tablets. Perhaps Anu's offer itself threatened the order Enki had established. If Enki made humanity mortal, did Anu have the right to alter that design unilaterally? Was refusing immortality through deception another act of preserving creator prerogative against outside intervention? Again, the tablets leave us with procedure and consequence, not certainty of motive. Adapa obeyed. Immortality was refused. Mortality remained. Every human death thereafter in this narrative lies in the shadow of that exchange. And so the same question returns from another angle. Was Enki humanity's greatest protector, or the architect of its permanent limitation? Was he the god who saved humans from extinction, only to preserve them within carefully bounded weakness, wisdom without immortality, culture without equality, survival without full release? The tablets do not force the answer. They make the answer difficult, perhaps intentionally difficult. Perhaps because ambiguity itself was part of what the scribes preserved. Not uncertainty by accident, but uncertainty as record. The gods were not unified. Their actions were not transparent. Their judgments conflicted. Their motives could protect and constrain at once. And from this uneasy ambiguity, another transfer of power enters the tradition, one that looks like theft, diplomacy, intoxication, and lawful permanence, all at once. Inanna's acquisition of the me from Enki, where power changes hands, not through battle, but through gift, regret, pursuit, and a concession that cannot be undone. If the Adapa story turns on wisdom withheld, and immortality denied the tale of Inanna, and the me turns on something equally unsettling, power transferred in a way that feels both illicit and legitimate at the same time. It is one of the strangest patterns in these texts. Again and again, something immense changes hands. But the category under which that transfer should be understood remains unstable. Is it theft, gift seizure, lawful acquisition through cunning? The tablets resist clean moral labels. The Emi themselves resist easy description. They are powers, functions, authorities, principles, perhaps even offices or capacities. And yet the texts treat them with almost material concreteness. They can be held, presented, loaded onto boats, installed elsewhere. Their list is astonishingly broad: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, weapons, music, sexuality, law, craft, descent into the underworld, ascent from it, social structures and disruptive forces alike. Civilization seems to rest not on one abstract essence, but on many distributed powers that can somehow be possessed and transferred. In the story of Inanna's visit to Enki and Eridu, the framework is not war at first. It is hospitality, visit, feast, drink, exchange. Enki, pleased with Inanna's presence, drinks heavily and becomes expansive. The text repeats the same pattern with ritual insistence. In the name of my power, in the name of my holy shrine to Inanna, I shall give. Then a set of me is named. Inanna accepts more drink, another offering, another acceptance. Again and again, until an extraordinary transfer has taken place. The rhythm matters. Repetition matters. Because this is not narrated as sudden theft from a locked treasury. It unfolds as a transaction witnessed through speech and acceptance. That is why Enki's regret later becomes such a legal problem. When he sobers and asks where the Emi have gone, his minister reminds him, "You gave them." That reply is devastating in its simplicity. Not they were stolen, not they were taken in secret. You gave them. Enki is troubled, and his trouble is understandable. The powers that made Eridu central, the powers that grounded civilizational prestige in his city, are now moving toward Uruk. He sends pursuit after pursuit to intercept Inanna and recover what has left his domain. The sea creatures are dispatched. His minister follows. Demands are made. Return them. Undo this movement. But Inanna's defense never changes. What was given freely cannot be taken back. The transaction is complete. The text does not punish her for this argument. It lets it stand. That matters because later traditions might have framed the entire episode as fraud, a drunken grant revoked at sobriety. But the Sumerian logic seems stricter in another way. Offer and acceptance bind. The mental state of regret afterward does not erase the formal speech that transferred the me. Once Inanna reaches Uruk and installs them there, the shift becomes permanent. Enki in the end concedes. What has gone cannot be recalled. Uruk is greater now. Eridu is diminished. And again, the deeper question is not simply moral, it is structural. If civilizational authority can move because one god gives too much in hospitality, then power among the Anunnaki is not secure by essence alone. It can be altered by procedure, by speech, by transaction. The universe these tablets describe is not governed only by overwhelming force. It is also governed by transfer rules. And once transfer occurs, even a powerful god may have no lawful recourse. One can read this as memory of political change, of cultural centrality, shifting from one city to another. One can read it as wisdom about opportunity and intelligence. One can read it as a story of how authority migrates when old centers grow vulnerable. But whatever interpretation is preferred, the text preserves something stark. What changes hands does not easily return. The same principle in darker form appears in the Anzu rebellion. Unlike Inanna's acquisition of the Anzu's seizure of the Tablet of Destinies, it is not ambiguous in the same way. The text frames it as rebellion, calculated rebellion. Anzu has access to Enlil's inner space. He watches the ritual moment when Enlil removes crown and garments to purify himself. The tablet rests nearby. Vulnerability opens. Ambition responds. Anzu's internal reasoning is laid out with unnerving clarity. I will take the tablet. I will control the commands of the gods. I will establish my throne. I will govern. This is not impulse. It is strategy. He knows what the tablet means. Not merely symbol, but operational authority. Whoever possesses it can command. Whoever holds it bends fate. Then the theft occurs, and the universe changes at once. Silence descends. Brilliance leaves the divine chambers. Enlil is reduced, not simply embarrassed, but stripped of effective authority. The text makes the tablet feel less like ceremonial regalia and more like the central instrument of sovereignty itself. Without it, kingship falters. Order pauses. Speech loses force. Again, the implication is staggering. Divine rule rests at least in part on possession of an object, not only on character, not only on rank, not only on inherited dignity, on possession. Hold the instrument, hold the command. Lose it, lose rule. That is a fragile system, and the text does not hide its fragility. The council responds in crisis. Anu asks who will confront Anzu. One by one, potential champions hesitate. Whoever holds the tablet can turn force against the attacker. Winds can be reversed. Fire can be redirected. Strategy itself can be preempted. This is why Ninurta's eventual mission matters. He cannot simply attack harder. He needs a way around the tablet's field of control. He needs a strategy that does not move straight into Destiny's command. Ea, or Enki in the Akkadian frame, offers the crucial guidance. Strike not the body first, but the wings. Disable motion. Disrupt holding. Make the tablet fall. Then the vulnerable rebel can be killed and the object restored. The plan works. Anzu falls. The tablet returns. Enlil's order resumes. But the restoration does not erase the revelation. The revelation remains. Divine authority can be stolen, even if only briefly, even if the rebel cannot consolidate it, even if the order returns. The order has now learned something about itself. It is not invulnerable. Its center can be seized. Its procedures create moments of weakness. Ritual obligation itself can become exploitable. That detail matters. Enlil was vulnerable because he was fulfilling required purification. He was not merely inattentive. He was obeying protocol, which means protocol both sustains order and creates openings against order. Rules make legitimacy possible, but they also produce predictable moments of exposure. And perhaps that is one of the deepest patterns running across these narratives. Not simply that betrayal occurs, but that betrayal often occurs through the very structures designed to prevent chaos. Oaths create loopholes. Hospitality creates transfer. Ritual creates vulnerability. Jurisdiction creates gaps. The system generates the forms by which the system is breached. If that sounds modern, it is because administrative order often works that way. A loophole is not outside the law. It is produced by law. A procedural evasion is not lawlessness exactly. It is law turned sideways. Again and again, the tablets seem aware of this, as if the scribes knew that systems are most fragile, not where they are absent, but where they are elaborate. And from there, the tradition turns downward toward another jurisdiction where law is even more absolute, and family offers no protection at all. The underworld of Ereshkigal, where Inanna's descent becomes not a symbolic romance of death and return, but a crisis of entry, execution, substitution, and a legal order no one dares casually overturn. The descent of Inanna into the underworld is often remembered for its imagery for the 7 gates, the stripped regalia, the corpse on the hook. But beneath the image lies something colder, more rigid, more procedural. The underworld in these tablets is not merely a place of shadows. It is a jurisdiction. It has rules, it has judges, it has thresholds, and once entered, it does not bend because the entrant is divine. Before Inanna descends, she prepares carefully. That detail should not be rushed past. She does not wander downward in impulse alone. She dresses for the passage. She carries the signs of power proper to her station. And she instructs Ninshuber in exact contingency steps. If I do not return, mourn. Go to Enlil, then to Nana, then to Enki. The sequence matters because the situation she anticipates is one in which rescue will require recognized channels of appeal. Even before anything happens, the text is structured as procedure. At the first gate she is questioned. At each gate she is questioned. Name, purpose, authority. Then the answer comes, enter. But the rules of the underworld must be fulfilled. One item removed, then another, then another. The repetition is essential. It slows the movement. It makes the process feel formal, inevitable, administrative. Inanna is not simply being humbled, she is being processed. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she is stripped of recognized power. And then the act comes with startling abruptness. The judges of the underworld surround her. Judgment is passed. She is turned into a corpse and hung on the wall. The text gives almost no psychological commentary. It does not explain at length whether she came in grief for Gugalana, or ambition, or challenge. It records the sentence. That reserve is part of what makes the scene severe. If later traditions seek emotional drama, this text often seeks something else. It seeks the exact point where one jurisdiction meets another and finds that rank does not transfer. 3 days pass. Ninshuber performs exactly as instructed. Public lament, appeal to Enlil, refusal, appeal to Nana, refusal. Both answer in roughly the same logic. She went there of her own will. The underworld has its laws. We will not interfere. This is one of the most revealing moments in the whole corpus. Even major gods acknowledge limits. They do not deny Inanna's value. They deny their right to overturn a foreign jurisdiction. Only Enki acts differently. Even then, he does not storm the underworld with force. He acts through craft. He creates 2 beings from dirt beneath his fingernails, gives them the food and water of life, and instructs them carefully in how to speak. They are not to threaten, not to argue sovereignty. They are to sympathize, to mirror Ereshkigal's pain until she offers a reward. Then they are to request only the corpse. Again, rescue comes through procedural intelligence, not frontal assault. The underworld is not overpowered, it is maneuvered. Permission is obtained. Inanna is revived. But the next rule falls immediately into place. No one leaves without a substitute. The text will not allow resurrection to function as erasure of legal requirement. Something must remain below. That is when the story becomes not only about entry and law, but about transfer of burden. As Inanna returns upward, the demons of the underworld accompany her. Wherever they move, mourners are encountered, and Inanna refuses them one after another. No, not that one. They lamented me. The repetition matters because it clarifies criteria. Grief becomes evidence of loyalty. Mourning becomes legal shield. Then she reaches Uruk and sees Dumuzi on the throne, dressed richly unmarked by sorrow. Her response is immediate and devastating. Eye of death, word of wrath, cry of guilt. Take this one. Dumuzi's offense is not trespass into the underworld. It is failure of expected loyalty, failure to mourn, failure to embody the bond that should have been visible in absence. And for that failure, he becomes substitute. The punishment is not symbolic disappointment. It is transfer into death's jurisdiction. Even then, the process does not end in a single line. Dumuzi flees. His sister intervenes. A compromise is negotiated. Half the year below, half above, with his sister taking the other share. The underworld accepts. A permanent arrangement is established. Again, we return to the same pattern, not healing but settlement, not mercy but structure. The system does not dissolve because feeling is intense. It incorporates feeling into a binding arrangement. Whose betrayal is this? The question remains deliberately unstable. Did Inanna betray Ereshkigal by descending into a domain not hers, perhaps to challenge it, perhaps to satisfy obligation, perhaps both? Did Ereshkigal betray sisterhood by executing her without trial, as we would understand trial? Did Inanna betray Dumuzi by shifting the burden of her release onto him? Or did Dumuzi betray her first by failing even the visible rituals of grief? The text refuses to simplify. Each figure acts within some recognizable logic of power. Ereshkigal governs the dead and protects that sovereignty absolutely. Inanna chooses the substitute and exercises authority with terrible force. Dumuzi becomes casualty of a structure larger than his own offense. Just Inanna offers herself and transforms punishment into alternating order. And beneath all of it is one of the most severe ideas in the Mesopotamian world: jurisdiction supersedes kinship. Sisters may still be sisters, but in the underworld, that does not matter enough to halt law. Family does not erase office. Affection does not annul domain. The system is stronger than the bond. That same chilling truth appears again in the tradition of Nergal and Ereshkigal, where insult, confrontation, coercion, and eventual co-rule reveal another way divine order adapts when violence cannot be undone. At the banquet in heaven, Ereshkigal cannot attend because her office binds her below. She sends her representative. Every god stands in respect except Nergal. He remains seated. The offense is not ambiguous. Protocol has been broken. Honor withheld. Namtar returns with the report, and Ereshkigal's reaction is immediate. Bring him down. He will answer for this. Again, we are not in the realm of vague emotional offense. We are in protocol violation. Nergal descends under advice, and the advice is telling. Refuse disarmament. Push through the gates. Reach the throne before judgment is spoken. Seize the queen before procedure can close around you. In other words, beat the legal process with physical force. It is one of the most direct assaults on jurisdiction in the whole corpus. He does exactly that. He reaches Ereshkigal, drags her from the throne, threatens her life. And then comes another remarkable turn. She does not answer with pleading sentiment. She answers with pragmatic truth. Kill me, and who will govern the dead? If the underworld loses rule, disorder spreads everywhere. You cannot simply destroy this office and leave its consequences unmanaged. The result is not romance in any gentle sense. It is negotiated power sharing under pressure. Rule with me, share the throne, divide time. What begins in insult and force becomes formalized arrangement. Nergal leaves, then fails to return, and only after threat of cosmic imbalance is he compelled back. At last he takes his seat beside her. Again the pattern holds. What cannot be reversed is institutionalized. Violation becomes structure. A crisis of sovereignty becomes co-rule. Emotion is present certainly, but the text is more interested in how power stabilizes after breach than in how breach felt. And we are now prepared almost reluctantly to return to the flood itself, because everything we have seen gathers there: council procedure, jurisdictional disagreement, oath, loophole, catastrophic enforcement aftermath without reconciliation. The flood is not isolated from the rest. It is the place where the logic of all the other fractures becomes most visible and most terrible. No story in this corpus returns more insistently than the flood. And perhaps that is because no other story gathers so many of the system's contradictions into one sequence. Authority, jurisdiction, procedure oaths, dissent, regret, survival, punishment, compromise. The flood is not simply destruction. It is the moment when the governing order reveals what it is capable of authorizing, and what one of its own members is willing to do to prevent that authorization from becoming absolute. The Atrahasis version gives the fullest sequence. Humanity multiplies, cities expand, activity intensifies. The text repeats the key complaint noise. Whether literal sound or a larger metaphor for human pressure, the complaint is framed as disruption. Enlil cannot sleep. The ordered surface he governs has become intolerably full of human presence. That is the beginning of the policy question. What is to be done when creation fills the ruler's domain beyond what he will accept? Enlil's first response is not immediate annihilation. It is reduction, famine, withheld provision, agricultural collapse. The text describes food, cut off plant life, reduced scarcity imposed. Humans suffer, but the suffering is still framed as policy rather than final solution. Then Enki intervenes by instruction. Tell the people to channel worship toward the deity associated with grain. Concentrate pressure. Redirect devotion. Force a divine ally to advocate for relief. The suffering eases. Humanity recovers. The second attempt comes through drought. Rain withheld. Waters below restrained. Salt whitening the fields. Again, the description is precise enough to feel environmental, specific enough to feel observed. Again, humanity suffers. Again, Enki intervenes through tactical religious instruction, direct appeals where they will matter. The drought ends. Humanity survives. It is only then that Enlil turns toward the final measure. The people remain too many. The noise returns. Partial measures have failed. And so the council is summoned toward a more terrible conclusion. This is the part that matters most, because the flood is not described as an inexplicable tantrum of divine rage. It is described as decision. Let the gods bind themselves by oath. Let no warning be given. Let the flood come. Let humanity perish completely. This is the line that echoes through everything else. Not simply that the flood happened, but that it was planned under formal silence. Each member of the council swears. The oath is not incidental. It transforms a policy into binding collective will. It also transforms dissent afterward into something more than disagreement. It becomes oath-breaking, or something close enough to provoke the same crisis. Enki swears. The text insists on that. He does not stand outside the procedure from the beginning. He enters it. He accepts the binding structure, at least outwardly. Which is why what follows feels so charged. He goes to the house of Atrahasis. Not to Atrahasis directly, the tablets are careful on this point, but to the reed wall of the house. Reed wall, listen to my words. The phrasing is famous because it is almost legal theater. The listener is present, but not named as listener. The warning is given, but not in the direct manner the oath may have prohibited. And then come the details, one after another, as if urgency demanded precision rather than poetry. Dismantle your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, reject goods, save the seed of living things. The dimensions must correspond. The height and breadth must be equal. The decks must be arranged in levels and compartments. The vessel must be sealed with bitumen. Family animals, craftsmen, supplies, all must enter before the storm begins. The specificity matters. Again and again, it matters. This is not vague warning, not a dream too symbolic to obey. It is engineering language, practical instruction, measured survival. Atrahasis follows the instructions. The boat is built. The loading is done. Animals come. Household enters. Human skill itself is preserved in remnant form through the inclusion of craftspeople. Then the flood is unleashed. The gods are not described as one undifferentiated force. They perform assigned roles. One thunders. Another tears out the posts. Another makes the dikes overflow. Torches flare. Mountain and plain are crossed by heralding destruction. The flood becomes coordinated operation, not nature simply happening, but authority enacted through divided functions. And then comes one of the most haunting reversals in all the tablets. Even the gods are terrified by what they have released. They retreat upward. They crouch like dogs by the wall of heaven. They did not fully grasp the force they authorized, or if they did, they cannot bear to witness it. This is where the text becomes morally strange, in a way modern categories struggle to contain. The destroyers regret the destruction even as it unfolds. Nintu weeps. How could I have consented to this? How could I have spoken evil in the assembly? The Anunnaki weep with her. Lips parch. hunger follows. They are not serene executors of justice. They are horrified participants in their own decree. That detail changes the atmosphere of everything. It does not excuse. It does not soften. But it tells us the tablets are not interested in presenting a confident divine extermination. They are interested in showing a council capable of agreeing to something whose full reality exceeds even the emotional endurance of those who agreed. 7 days and 7 nights pass. The waters recede. Atrahasis opens the vessel and sees what remains. Nothing of the old world visible in its former complexity. Humanity returned to clay. The landscape flattened. The image is spare terrible and still somehow administrative in its restraint. Then sacrifice is offered. This moment is often remembered because the gods gather around the aroma like flies, and the image is almost humiliating in its bluntness. The same beings who sought relief from humanity's noise now cluster desperately around the one surviving human's offering. The asymmetry is impossible to miss. Humanity was burdensome, yet humanity's cult remained necessary. The species could be reduced nearly to extinction, but not erased entirely without consequences even the gods did not welcome. And that is the threshold of the confrontation still to come. Enlil arrives. The boat is seen. The impossible fact becomes visible. A human being has survived against decree. The first reaction is not gratitude, not relief that worship persists, but fury that the command failed. How did any man escape? No one was to live. All the earlier tensions now converge. The oath, the loophole, the authority of the council, the conscience of one God, the value of technical truth against intended silence. And the answer to that confrontation does not produce harmony. It produces the kind of settlement only broken systems know how to produce, not trust restored, but survival under new constraints. That aftermath matters so much that it requires its own space. Because the flood is not only the destruction, it is also the argument after the destruction, the compromise after the argument, and the long shadow those terms cast over every later story of gods, cities, mortality, and the limits placed on human life. When Enlil sees the boat, the crisis is no longer theoretical. The flood has already happened. The dead are already dead. The oath has already been strained or broken, depending on how one reads Enki's warning. And now the council must answer a new question. What is to be done not with humanity in the abstract, but with the undeniable fact that humanity remains? The confrontation is preserved in language that feels less like dramatic explosion than like post-crisis reckoning. Enlil accuses. Someone allowed this. Someone permitted a human to escape a decree meant to leave no human alive. The suspicion turns immediately toward Enki, and not without reason. Who else in the corpus repeatedly evades by intelligence, protects by indirect means, and regards humanity as a creation not to be discarded? Enki's defense is famously technical. He did not disclose the secret directly. He spoke to a wall, or in some versions he allowed Atrahasis to understand through a dream. The wording shifts, but the principle remains the same. He argues from form, from the narrow terms of the oath, from the possibility that communication can occur without direct speech. And this is exactly what makes the moment so troubling. Because on one level, the defense sounds evasive, even cynical. On another level, it exposes the weakness of any legal system that assumes literal compliance is equivalent to moral agreement. If the oath's wording allowed the preservation of life, then perhaps the wording was defective. If the spirit mattered more than the letter, then perhaps the system should have said so. Once again, the texts force us into the tension between procedure and justice, without resolving it cleanly. Other voices in the divine assembly complicate the matter further. Some support Enlil, a sworn decision cannot survive if members privately nullify it through cleverness. Others support Enki, or at least the outcome. Total extermination was too much. The flood was too much. The scale of the suffering exceeded what the grievance justified. And some, like Nintu, in her lament, are already carrying regret as a form of witness against the decision itself. The result is compromise, and compromise, here is not comforting. It is one of the bleakest settlements in the ancient world. Humanity will continue, but not as before. The old expansiveness will not return. Limits are imposed. Lifespans contract. Fertility is interrupted. Some women will not bear. Some births will not survive. Human increase itself is regulated through suffering, built into the structure of life after the flood. This point matters so much because the tablets do not present mortality, infertility, and infant death as merely natural conditions. They are framed within this narrative world as administrative consequences. Policy after catastrophe. Conditions of permitted survival. Humanity exists but under restriction. Allowed but bounded. So the flood does not end the problem. It formalizes a new relation between gods and humans. One marked not by trust, but by control. Not by innocence, but by memory of what the council once authorized, and what one god once prevented from becoming total. From Enlil's perspective, the betrayal remains Enki's. From Enki's perspective, the greater betrayal remains Enlil's decision that humanity could be erased as if it were an inconvenience. The text leaves both moral frameworks present, and perhaps that is precisely its force. It does not soothe the contradiction, it preserves it. What emerges is a system no longer able to believe fully in its own unity. After the flood, every oath carries the memory of the oath that did not hold in spirit. Every council carries the memory of the council that nearly authorized extinction. Every human life carries the memory of being both preserved and deliberately limited. This is not a return to innocence. It is the beginning of a permanently fractured order. That fracture helps illuminate another kind of divine betrayal, one directed not at humanity in general, but at a city, the abandonment of Agade. The curse of Agade describes a different pattern from the flood, though the same administrative logic remains. Here, the crisis begins, not with population, but with violation of sacred center. Agade rises through divine favor. Kingship is transferred. Prosperity flourishes. The city grows wealthy under patronage. The text is almost lavish in its description of abundance of trade, of ornament, of social life, stabilized by divine presence. Then silence falls. Omens cease. Diviners receive nothing. Prayers bring no answer. For 7 years, according to the composition, Naram Sin endures divine non-response. This detail is important because it makes his eventual act feel like desperation, not random impiety. He seeks meaning. He seeks signal. Nothing comes. Then he does the unthinkable. He enters Nippur. He attacks Enlil's temple. He loots the sacred center. And again the text grows precise. Silver, gold, copper, lapis lazuli, loaded away, removed, recorded. It is an inventory of sacrilege. The response does not come as lightning from a furious sky. It comes as procedure. Enlil withdraws protection. The great gods are summoned. Curses are allocated by domain. Agriculture fails under the god responsible for fields. Water fails under the god responsible for water. Military security collapses under the power governing strength in war. The structure is almost bureaucratic in its coldness. Every realm of stability is deactivated by the authority to which it belongs. The city falls. The people suffer. And here another terrible disproportionality enters the corpus. One king's offense, one ruler's choice. Yet an entire population bears the consequence. The texts themselves do not fully justify this. At moments, they almost seem aware of the tension. What did the people do? Why such scale of punishment? No clear answer is provided. This is why the word betrayal remains unstable again. Did Naram-Sin betray the gods by violating sacred boundary? Certainly within the text's framework, yes. Did the gods betray the city by withdrawing protection from countless people for the offense of one ruler? The composition does not say so directly, but the emotional force of the lament makes the question unavoidable. Agade's destruction becomes like the flood, a case study in a system whose procedures are real enough to operate, but severe enough to destroy multitudes in response to concentrated offense. Divine governance, as these tablets preserve, it is not sentimental, it is transactional. Protection is granted, protection can be withdrawn. Prosperity is not a right, it is an administered condition. And that perhaps is one of the deepest continuities between the flood and the fall of Agade. In both, a governing structure makes it procedurally possible for entire populations to suffer in response to decisions made above them. In both, consequence moves through formal channels. In both, survivors are left inside realities they did not choose. The old city laments echo the same logic. A patron deity leaves. Presence withdraws. The city once protected becomes exposed to invasion, famine, collapse. The gods do not always destroy directly. Sometimes they simply leave. And in leaving, they allow fragility to do the rest. This is why the cumulative effect of the tablets is so unsettling. They do not merely describe isolated myths. They describe a world in which authority is distributed, conditional, fiercely jurisdictional, and capable of devastating procedural action. The flood shows that total erasure can be contemplated. A god shows that protection can be formally withdrawn. Adapa shows that mortality can be preserved through deception. Inanna and the Mi show that power can migrate permanently through transaction. Anzu shows that sovereignty can be stolen. Ereshkigal shows that law below does not soften for kin above. By now, a pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. Not one story, not one exception, but structure. And because that structure repeats, the next step is not merely to recount more episodes. It is to stand back and ask what all of them taken together reveal about the world these tablets imagined, remembered, documented, or encoded. What system is visible once the individual betrayals are placed side by side? When the episodes are placed beside one another, a pattern emerges that feels less like a set of unrelated myths and more like a recurring model of governance. The first pattern is jurisdiction. Almost every major crisis turns on boundary. Enlil and Enki dispute humanity because humanity belongs in one sense to both creator and territorial ruler. Inanna enters the underworld and discovers that power above carries no exemption below. Nergal violates underworld protocol and can neither be expelled nor ignored, so the violation must be incorporated into rule. Inanna receives the Emmi from Eridu and transfers civilizational centrality toward Uruk. Anzu steals the tablet that authorizes fate across domains. The recurring issue is not chaos in the abstract. It is authority crossing its proper line. The second pattern is procedure. These crises do not unfold as random divine tantrums. They move through oath, feast, transfer, assembly, judgment, curse, sentence, substitution, allocation, withdrawal. Even rebellion is strategic rather than wild. Even rescue is usually tactical rather than direct. Enki does not smash the flood decree with open force. He evades through speech to a wall. Inanna does not storm Eridu. She receives, accepts, departs, defends her possession through the language of completed gift. Ereshkigal does not give speeches on cosmic justice. She enforces jurisdiction through gate-stripping judgment execution. The third pattern is irreversibility. This may be the most haunting of all. Once a break occurs, the old state does not return. Adapa refuses life. Humanity remains mortal. The Mi reach Uruk. They do not go back to Eridu. Dumuzi becomes substitute. The alternation is made permanent. A god falls. Its glory is not restored. The flood ends the old world. The new one continues under limitations never lifted. Even where order is reestablished, as after Anzu's rebellion, the system does not recover innocence. It now knows it can be breached. The fourth pattern is selective loyalty. The gods are not a unified moral block. They are powers with interests, affiliations, cities, domains, and philosophies. Enki repeatedly favors humanity, but in ways that also preserve hierarchy. Enlil repeatedly favors order and authority, even when that order becomes severe. Inanna favors acquisition, extension, intensity, the enlargement of her city and power. Ereshkigal favors absolute sovereignty below. Nergal favors force and cannot simply be fitted into protocol without transforming protocol itself. Alliances are temporary. Consensus is unstable. Oaths may bind speech, but they do not eliminate deeper conflict. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the most painful, is human cost. Humans die because gods deliberate. Cities fall because gods withdraw. Mortality persists because a single refusal occurred under advice from a divine patron. Civilization continues, but under terms established by powers whose unity is at best tactical. Human beings in these texts do not stand outside divine conflict. They inhabit its consequences. That does not mean the texts are simplistic in assigning blame. On the contrary, they are often unwilling to simplify. Enki preserves life, yet perhaps denies immortality. Enlil preserves order, yet perhaps authorizes disproportionate destruction. Inanna acquires the powers of civilization, yet by means that unsettle legitimacy. Ereshkigal enforces law, yet in doing so, becomes almost terrifying in the absoluteness of her office. Nergal is both violator and necessary co-ruler. the tablets do not reward us with moral neatness. What they do reward is attention. If these accounts are read as mythology, then they are mythology of remarkable structural consistency, concerned less with heroic ornament than with how systems behave under strain. If they are read as wisdom literature, then they teach not by abstraction, but by case study. They show. They repeat. They let patterns accumulate. If they are read as documentation, then they preserve the memory of a world in which authority was experienced as divided, procedural, unstable, and often costly to those who lived beneath it. Here it becomes important not to rush toward a conclusion too quickly, because one temptation is to decide once and for all that these are only stories. Another is to decide just as quickly that they are literal records of forgotten rulers. But the tablets themselves make haste difficult. They sit in a middle space. They feel documentary. They behave pedagogically. They endure mythically. They do not belong cleanly to one modern category. And perhaps this is why they have lasted, because they preserve questions that do not end when one interpretive framework is chosen. What is authority when those who hold it disagree fundamentally? What is law when the law can authorize outcomes later regretted, even by those who approve them? What is loyalty when conscience and oath diverge? What is survival when it depends on someone powerful choosing to violate consensus? What is civilization when its gifts come from powers that also deceive, withhold, punish, and compete? These questions are not ancient only. That is part of why the tablets continue to disturb, not because they are exotic, but because they are uncomfortably familiar at the level of structure. Systems divide authority. Systems produce loopholes. Systems generate catastrophes through procedure. Systems preserve themselves by compromise after trust has already broken. The ancient texts record this with a calm that can feel more unsettling than overt drama. Mainstream scholarship understandably sees in this a human projection. Societies describing their own anxieties by imagining gods as governors, judges, rivals, and administrators. That remains persuasive in many ways. But the alternative reading never fully disappears that the scribes themselves did not think they were projecting. They thought they were preserving serious knowledge. The details mattered because the events mattered. The procedures mattered because power truly operated that way. We do not have to decide that question yet. In fact, deciding too quickly would violate the pace these texts seem to ask of us. They ask us to remain with uncertainty longer than modern habits prefer, to hold more than one possibility open, to notice how often the same forms recur, to let the repetition itself become evidence of something, even if we still debate of what. So now we come to the interpretive crossroads directly, not because the patterns disappear without it, but because once the patterns are clear, the unavoidable question becomes how they should be read. Myth metaphor, memory, human projection, encoded wisdom, historical documentation, or some older category the scribes would not have divided the way we do. The tablets do not answer for us. They only present. The burden of interpretation falls forward into each generation that reads them, and into ours as well. There are, broadly speaking, 3 ways these texts are usually approached, though even those 3 often overlap more than they appear to. The first is the most familiar in modern scholarship mythology. By this reading, the stories of the Anunnaki are imaginative narratives created by human societies to explain natural disasters, political changes, mortality, sacred authority, and the fragility of civilization itself. The gods are not beings remembered as literal administrators, but narrative figures through whom large human questions can be staged. The flood in this framework becomes a mythic response to real flooding in Mesopotamian history. Catastrophic inundations did occur. Cities were destroyed. Layers of mud were left behind. Human communities needed not only practical explanations, but meaningful ones. A flood that nearly erased humanity becomes easier to think with if one god chose to save a remnant. The story gives shape to survival. It turns disaster into remembered order. The same method can be applied across the corpus. The movement of the me from Eridu to Uruk becomes symbolic memory of shifting cultural centrality. The curse of Agade becomes theological interpretation of imperial collapse. The rivalry of Enki and Enlil becomes dramatized tension between wisdom and authority, innovation and regulation, craft and command. The underworld narratives become reflections on death, grief sovereignty, and the irreversible cost of descent. There is much to recommend this view. It explains why human political structures appear in divine form, because humans think with what they know. Councils' oaths, temple jurisdictions' labor, disputes, negotiated settlements. Ancient societies projected these forms upward because these were the available models for power. The gods resemble courts and rulers because courts and rulers were already the social grammar through which life was organized. And yet, this interpretation, while powerful, leaves something unresolved. Why so much procedural detail? Why engineering dimensions for boats? Why repeated legal phrasing? Why the consistency across places and centuries? If these are only flexible imaginative constructions, myths vary, they transform. These texts do vary, yes, but often within a surprisingly stable administrative architecture. That stability keeps the question open. The second framework sees the texts as encoded wisdom. On this reading, the gods are not simply story characters. They are principles, powers, structures of existence. Enlil stands for order, hierarchy, law, the severe necessities of organized life. Enki stands for intelligence, adaptation, compassion, cunning, the capacity to preserve by subversion when rigid order becomes destructive. Inanna stands for appetite, sovereignty, attraction, danger, transfer, intensity. Ereshkigal stands for the inevitability of death, the law that cannot be negotiated away, the reality beneath desire and achievement. Read this way, the stories become philosophical instruction through narrative form. The flood is not just about water. It is about the danger of a system so committed to silence and control that it can justify extermination. Oedipa is not only about one man refusing immortality. It is about the human condition itself, wisdom granted, final release withheld. Inanna's descent becomes a lesson in stripping exposure and the impossibility of taking worldly status into the realm where all status ends. Nergal and Ereshkigal become a meditation on what happens when force meets inevitability and discovers it must govern with what it cannot abolish. This approach also has strong support. These texts were copied in scribal schools. They were preserved as teaching material. Their repetition would have trained memory, judgment, and sensitivity to structure. They are excellent educational instruments because they do not flatten themselves into explicit moral maxims. They require interpretation. They teach by showing consequence rather than by announcing doctrine. Still here too, something resists reduction. Wisdom literature often abstracts more than these texts do. It tends toward proverb, toward explicit framing, toward conceptual condensation. The Mesopotamian tablets remain stubbornly attached to named cities, named gods, temple centers, object transfers, and formal procedures. They do not always behave like pure allegory. They retain the texture of documentation even while carrying philosophical depth. That leads to the third framework, historical or quasi-historical memory. This is the least accepted in mainstream scholarship, yet it persists because the tablets themselves often seem to invite it. On this reading, the scribes believed they were preserving genuine events or genuine structures of authority. The Anunnaki were not literary metaphors first. They were understood as real powers who governed, taught, decreed, punished, and fought. The texts record not fantasies, but attempts to preserve how the world had been shaped. This does not solve every problem. In fact, it creates many. Modern scientific frameworks do not readily accommodate beings with the capacities attributed to these figures. Archaeology has not produced decisive evidence of advanced non-human administrators ruling Mesopotamian cities in the way modern speculative readings sometimes propose. Much of the language remains overtly religious and at times metaphysical. And yet the historical memory approach keeps returning because of the text's own self-presentation. They do not introduce themselves as fiction. The king list presents pre-flood and post-flood rulers in one continuous style. The flood traditions narrate decision and catastrophe with the same calm register used elsewhere for governance and cult. The stories often feel less like inventions than like preserved explanations. That is not proof, but it is part of why the question remains alive. Perhaps what is hardest is that none of these frameworks fully dissolves the others. Myth can carry memory. Wisdom can be housed in narrative presented as history. A scribe can sincerely believe he is recording events and still shape them in ways that instruct. Ancient categories were not ours. Important knowledge may have included what we separate into religion, law, myth, archive, and philosophy. If so, then our interpretive difficulty may say as much about us as about the tablets. We want one shelf for myth, another for history, another for literature, another for spiritual teaching. The tablets seem indifferent to those divisions. They preserve what mattered. They preserve it with repetition structure and care. They do not stop to tell us which modern category should contain it. That is why the ambiguity is not a flaw to be hurried past. It may be part of the text's method. They present events, structures, judgments, and consequences. They force the reader to think, not simply to absorb doctrine, but to weigh patterns, compare cases, and decide what kind of truth is being offered. And before we close, we need to linger with that ambiguity a little longer. Because if the question of interpretation remains open, then the meaning of betrayal remains open too. Betrayal as mythic motif. Betrayal as encoded wisdom, betrayal as remembered fact, or betrayal as all three at once preserved because it was central to how the ancient world understood the origin of its limits, its cities, its mortality, and its unease with power itself. So the question turns back slowly toward us. Not only what happened in the stories, but what kind of truth these stories are carrying. And perhaps the most honest answer is that the texts do not let us rest in a single register for very long. If they are myths of unusual restraint. They do not always seek wonder first. They often seek sequence, procedure, allocation, record. They name cities. They name temples, they assign functions, They repeat formulas. They preserve the architecture of authority with a bureaucratic care that feels almost anti-romantic. That does not make them less mythic, but it does make them mythic in a distinctive way. If they are wisdom texts, they teach with extraordinary patience. They do not rush to paraphrase themselves. They repeat a principle through different episodes, oath in one place, threshold in another, transfer here, withdrawal there, law below, law above. The same question returns from different angles until the reader begins to see not one story, but a pattern of how power behaves when divided and pressured. That is sophisticated teaching, and it is teaching without premature explanation. If they are memory, then they are memory filtered through reverence and fear, yet still determined to preserve formal structure. In that case, the procedural language is not decorative, it is essential. These are not tales invented to entertain an evening audience. They are reminders of how authority once functioned, what terms govern survival, and why the world after catastrophe feels narrower than the world before it. There is another possibility, as well more difficult, and perhaps more faithful, to the tablets themselves, that these categories were never cleanly separate in the first place. Perhaps a text could be historical, because it preserved what was believed to have happened mythic, because the beings involved were divine and wise, because what had happened revealed permanent truths about authority and consequence. That mixture may feel unstable to us only because our classifications came much later. Again and again, the tablets return to one lesson without naming it directly. Authority does not guarantee unity. Procedure does not guarantee justice. Consensus does not guarantee wisdom. And betrayal is not always merely treachery. Sometimes it is conscience against law. Sometimes it is law against kinship. Sometimes it is survival purchased by violation. Sometimes it is the system itself making disaster possible. That is why the flood remains central, even after all the other episodes have been examined. It is the clearest place where the system exposes its own capacity for sanctioned catastrophe. The council can vote, the oath can bind, the decree can stand. Yet what is authorized may still be unbearable. Enki's action does not prove that procedure is meaningless. It proves that procedure can fail at the level of moral adequacy. And once that has happened, every later oath carries a wound. The same logic radiates outward. Adapa obeys and loses immortality. Inanna lawfully receives what feels almost stolen. Dumuzi suffers for another's release. Agade falls under curses distributed with chilling order. The stories differ in scale and scene, but they converge in the same uneasy recognition systems of authority, often preserve themselves by producing losses no one fully repairs. This is perhaps why modern readers still feel the pull of these old clay tablets. Not because we expect to settle the question of the Anunnaki once and for all, but because the structures described are painfully legible. Institutions conflict internally. Rules create loopholes. Responsibility diffuses upward, while consequence falls downward. Catastrophe becomes possible not only through rage, but through process. And still the tablets do not collapse into cynicism. That is important. They do not say all authority is meaningless. They do not say law has no force. On the contrary, law has enormous force. Procedure has enormous force. Too much force, perhaps. enough force to shape mortality to preserve remnant life, to condemn cities, to formalize compromises that last for generations. The problem is not that order is unreal. The problem is that order is divided, and division under power can become more dangerous than open chaos. In that sense, the ancient scribes were preserving something far more subtle than simple piety or skepticism. They were preserving complexity. Gods could be protectors and deceivers. Kingship could be sacred and disastrous. Wisdom could save and withhold. Thresholds could be necessary and merciless. A city could prosper by divine favor and perish by divine withdrawal. Humanity could be created for service, nearly erased, then permitted to continue under lasting limitation. None of that is tidy. The tablets do not try to make it tidy. And perhaps that refusal is itself part of their authority. They are not propaganda in the simple sense. They do not tell the reader what to conclude in every scene. They present cases. They preserve speech. They show outcomes. The burden of judgment is left partly to the one who reads. That is not weakness. It may be one of the reasons they endured. For more than 1,000 years, scribes copied these materials. That endurance tells us something. Whatever else these texts were, they mattered. They were not discarded as idle fantasies. They were transmitted because they preserved essential understanding, whether of ritual, of kingship, of divine order, of mortality, or of all of these together. And so the interpretive question remains, but it remains in a more refined form now. Not merely, did these events literally happen? But what kind of reality were the scribes trying to preserve? A literal past, a theological structure, a memory of catastrophe, a map of authority, a teaching on how power wounds and yet remains necessary. The answer may be plural. The answer may be layered. What we can say with confidence is that the texts preserve betrayals not as accidental deviations from a harmonious cosmos, but as recurring expressions of a world in which authority is divided at the highest level. In that world, trust is provisional. Loyalty is conditional. Boundaries are essential and unstable at once. And the consequences of rupture endure far longer than the moment of rupture itself. All of which brings us back to the tablet in the museum vault, the wedge marks still sharp, the words still legible, the old questions still waiting. Because after all the episodes, after all the interpretations, one thing remains unchanged. The clay survives. The testimony survives. And whatever else we make of it, the ancient insistence on remembering survives with it. The museum vault remains at 68 degrees. The clay remains still. The marks remain exactly where a hand pressed them 4,000 years ago. Around that stillness, everything else has changed. Cities fell, cities, temples emptied, languages fractured and were relearned, dynasties vanished, scholars dug in dust, catalog numbers were assigned, fragments were collated, yet the old account remains where it was placed, waiting not to change its words, but to meet new readers with the same unresolved force. We have followed those words through a series of fractures. Enki and Enlil not as simple rivals for prestige, but as divided authorities whose conflict over humanity reveals a deeper constitutional fault in the world these texts describe. Adapa offered wisdom but not immortality. Then, standing before a lost chance, because the one who taught him discernment also instructed him to refuse life. Inanna acquiring the me through speech, acceptance, intoxication, and a transfer that regret could not reverse. Anzu seizing the tablet of destinies and exposing how vulnerable sovereignty becomes when it depends on a holdable object. Inanna descending and discovering that the underworld is not impressed by power from above. Dumuzi taking her place because grief was absent where grief should have been present. Nergal entering by force what he could not lawfully command, and being made to share the throne he had violated. The flood, where oath, conscience, procedure, and catastrophe converge. A god where divine abandonment operates through coldly distributed curse and the city pays for its king. When seen separately, each account is strange. When seen together, they become something more than strange. They become a body of thought, a sustained reflection on power, obligation, law, and consequence. Not reflection in the modern essayistic sense, perhaps, but reflection in preserved form. Example after example. Pattern after pattern. A civilization thinking in stories, because stories can hold what abstract principle alone cannot hold. That may be why the question of meaning remains alive instead of fading. If these were only decorative myths, perhaps their force would have dimmed. If they were only symbolic lessons, stripped of texture, perhaps they would have become flatter with time. But they retain both texture and philosophical pressure. They are specific enough to feel grounded, open enough to remain interpretable, repetitive enough to reveal structure, and unresolved enough to continue demanding thought. This is especially true when we ask what the texts reveal about betrayal itself. Betrayal in these tablets is rarely sentimental. It is rarely just about affection broken. It is more often about hierarchy, breached oath, circumvented authority, overstepped trust used against itself. A wall is spoken to instead of a man. A gift is accepted at the exact moment generosity outruns caution. A ritual obligation creates the opening for theft. A threshold strips power one piece at a time. A city loses everything because favor is withdrawn according to domain. Again and again, betrayal appears not as the opposite of order, but as something generated within order. That is one of the deepest and most unsettling ideas preserved here. Systems do not only fail because outsiders attack them. They fail because their own procedures create vulnerabilities. They fail because divided authority produces competing loyalties. They fail because a rule that maintains legitimacy in one moment can become the instrument of destruction in another. And still, the tablets do not simply denounce the system. They also show that without system, there is no recognizable world at all. The underworld needs rule. Cities need patronage. Kingship needs transmission. Cult needs exchange. Waterfield, war, fertility, wisdom. All need allocated domains. Order is necessary. The problem is not order versus disorder in any simple sense. The problem is that order itself carries contradiction inside it. Perhaps that is why the scribes preserved these materials with such care. Not because they solved the contradiction, but because they taught how to live with awareness of it. A human city in this worldview does not stand upon stable certainty. It stands within negotiated favor, contested authority, inherited limits, and the memory of earlier ruptures. Mortality itself is remembered not as pure nature, but as consequence. Survival after the flood is remembered not as triumph, but as permission under restriction. Civilization is remembered not as autonomous achievement, but as a field of gifts, transfers, withholdings, and divine disagreements. Whether modern readers accept the supernatural frame literally, is almost secondary to the structural insight. The texts are deeply interested in what it feels like to inhabit a world shaped by decisions made far above one's influence. That is one reason they do not lose relevance. Human beings still live that way in many forms, under institutions' inherited consequences, distant councils, old compromises no one alive originally chose. The old clay preserves that condition with unusual candor. And so the question returns once more, not because it is unresolved by accident, but because its repetition is part of the experience these texts create. What are we reading? Myth, wisdom, memory. Each answer illuminates something and leaves something in shadow. To call them myth explains their symbolic breadth, but not always their documentary tone. To call them wisdom literature explains their pedagogical endurance, but not always their concrete specificity. To call them historical memory explains their self-seriousness, but not their full metaphysical range. The texts remain larger than any one label. Perhaps that is why it is useful to let the final approach them not as solved objects, but as witnesses. Clay witnesses, limited partial ancient, but still speaking. They do not tell us how to classify them. They tell us what they preserve. Councils, decrees, boundaries, warnings, punishments, rescues, settlements, and the long endurance of consequences. It is the reader who must decide what kind of truth that preservation constitutes. And yet one final movement remains. Because after the analysis, after the classification, after the repeated returns to authority and betrayal, there is still the quieter question that hangs over the whole inquiry. Why does it matter now? Why should these old arguments, these old oaths, these old tablets continue to occupy the mind? The answer lies not only in what they may once have recorded, but in what they still make visible when read with patience. Why does it matter that a scribe once pressed these signs into wet clay? Why does it matter that the tablet survived when the city did not? Why does it matter that the words remain legible while the temples that frame them have long since collapsed into dust? It matters because the tablets preserve one of humanity's earliest sustained meditations on power in conflict. They preserve a world in which authority is not singular, not serene, not innocent, but divided, procedural, and capable of consequences that endure far beyond the moment of decision. Whether we call that world mythic, symbolic, historical, or some fusion of all three, the questions it raises have not gone away. The gods in these texts create and constrain. They teach and withhold. They protect and deceive. They govern through councils, but councils fracture. They swear oaths, but oaths prove vulnerable to conscience cunning or loophole. They punish cities. They limit species. They dispute jurisdiction. They regret what they themselves authorize. This is not the image of divine order as smooth perfection. It is the image of order under strain from within. And because of that, the human position in the tablets is never simple. Humanity is created to bear burdens, nearly destroyed because it becomes burdensome, preserved because one authority refuses total erasure, then limited perhaps permanently so that survival never again becomes threatening. Civilization rises under gifts that are also forms of dependency. Mortality persists because of a refusal shaped by divine instruction. Cities thrive under patronage and fall under withdrawal. Humans do not control the system that shapes them. They inherit it, endure it, adapt within it. That may be the deepest continuity between their world and ours, not the names, not the cosmology, not the temples, but the experience of living inside structures one did not design, bearing consequences from decisions made elsewhere, and trying to understand whether those structures are just necessary, broken, or simply old. If the tablets are myths, then they are myths that grasped structural reality with extraordinary precision. If they are wisdom texts, then they are wise because they refuse simplification. If they are memory, then they are memory that has outlived the civilization that first guarded it. Each possibility remains open, and perhaps the openness is not a defect. Perhaps it is what allows the tablets to continue speaking across so much silence. Imagine again the scribe at the end of the work, the hand steady, the stylus pressing one final wedge. The decision already old, even then the betrayal already long absorbed into tradition, yet still important enough to record. Why? Because someone believed it needed to be remembered. The flood, the warning, the oath, the transfer of powers, the denial of immortality, the execution below, the curse upon a city. The scribes did not preserve these things casually. They preserved them because they thought the shape of the world could be better understood by keeping these accounts alive. And they succeeded. The tablet endured. The vault is quiet now. The air remains controlled. The clay remains still. Margaret Chen's warmth is unprovable. The words are not. The words remain. And because they remain, the question remains with them. What exactly has been remembered here? History remembered as sacred narrative. Sacred narrative remembered with historical seriousness. Philosophical teaching disguised as event. Event preserved in the only theological and procedural language available to those who witnessed or inherited it. We do not know. The tablets do not settle the matter. They present the evidence and leave us in the presence of it. That perhaps is why they still matter. They do not demand passive belief. They demand thought. They ask us to examine how authority functions, how loyalty breaks, how systems authorize harm, how survival sometimes depends on defiance, and how consequences once set in motion become the conditions later generations simply call reality. If you have moved through this entire long night of reflection, then you have already done what the tablets seem to ask. You have stayed with the question instead of rushing past it. You have allowed repetition to do its work. You have returned to the same problems from different angles: authority law, betrayal, consequence, memory. Not because repetition is wasteful, but because some questions are large enough that a single pass is not enough. And so we end where we began, in the cool air around an ancient tablet, with the old uncertainty still intact. The gods described there, if they were ever more than literary powers, are silent now. Their temples are ruins. Their cults are gone. The scribes are dead. The cities are dust. Yet the clay remains, and in that clay remains a testimony that the people who made these tablets believed betrayal was central to understanding how their world had been formed, damaged, preserved, and limited. The question remains open. What do these betrayals mean? What do they preserve? What do they teach? What do they reveal? The tablets do not close the question. They hold it. They keep holding it 4,000 years later. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. If one thought lingered with you more than the others, hold on to it a little longer. These tablets have endured because some questions are worth returning to. Not once, but again and again, each time from a different angle, each time with a different kind of silence around them.